My first guest this evening has followed the journey of Cardinal George Pell through the Australian court system from the very beginning, serving as a source to various news outlets throughout the trial. He's here tonight to tell us what he saw throughout this legal process that recently pronounced Pell guilty of sex abuse. Was justice served, or was the Cardinal unjustly convicted of crimes he may not have committed? And how did the media influence all of this? Joining me now via Skype from Sydney, Australia, please welcome John MACAULAY. John, thanks for being here. Tell me about the Victoria Police, John. In March of 2013, the Victoria Police in this municipality established a task force named Operation Tethering to find possible unreported serious crimes committed by Pell. So the existence of the task force was first made public in March of 2018 when Pell's counsel interviewed Victoria Police detectives. I mean, this was basically an operation that was set up to look for crimes where no complaints had been made. How did this affect what was gathered and the way in which he was brought to trial?
Cardinal Pell from day one has had to defend himself with one hand tied behind his back. Operation Tethering that you've just referred to, Raymond, was an extraordinary breach of what Australians expected in their Magna Carta rights. The idea that the local constabulary would actually set up a task force without any complaint having been lodged by any member of the public. It was essentially a dirt-finding exercise, and one that was also corroborated by the exploratory exercise of Australia's largest publishing house, who sought to write a book. So there was a lot of people going around Melbourne asking lots of questions, trying to build a profile on Cardinal Pell, and in the end they've got enough material to build a case.
Wow. Cardinal Pell was accused of and found guilty this week of sexually abusing two choir boys in Melbourne's St. Patrick's Cathedral. Now, they claim this happened after the 10:30 a.m. Mass, a Sunday Mass, in 1996. The event is said to have taken place in a public space at its most crowded time. Now, you were an altar server at this cathedral in the late 1990s, John. You do not think the abuse described could have happened. Tell me why.
At the end of every Mass, in fact, accuracy is very important in these things. It was an 11 a.m. Mass that the Cardinal would always attend. And after Mass, as an altar server, I'd often observe him standing outside of the cathedral for at least half an hour. He'd stand there until the last person was there to meet and to greet and to chat with. And yet the accusation is that somehow, immediately after Mass, in the course of processing back to the sacristy, which His Grace would never do, he'd stay there and remain on the footsteps of the cathedral. Right. He somehow bilocated to find himself in an empty sacristy, which was never the case. It's extraordinary, beyond belief, that these accusations could ever have been brought to trial, and it's all the more alarming that a jury were able to find him guilty with such a lack of evidence.
Now, as part of the evidence, they said Pell was only in the cathedral at that time 2 times in that month, in the month where this is alleged to have happened. One of the victims recanted before dying multiple times. He said this didn't happen. There was no abuse. So only one of the victims stood trial against Pell. What did you think of him? Did you think he was credible, this witness J, as he's described?
No, I observed the chap on the outside of the courtroom, and I have serious reservations about his reliability as a witness. The reality is that his testimony is entirely uncorroborated by any other facts. He's brought into the case a second person who was already deceased, and that's being put about by the media here as if there were 2 people witnessing what are described as awful crimes, when in fact it was only one person who's put this before the police long after the other person is deceased.
Wow. And the person deceased, apparently, the reportage I've read, he claimed that this never happened. He told his mother this, I guess, on 2 occasions before he died, that there was no abuse. Also, Pell was in his full vestment. So this 6-minute abuse, which is the time period they're allocating to it, 6 minutes of abuse is an awful short amount of time to have gotten around your vestments to have committed the kind of awful abuse that is charged here.
Look, we can look at the detail of the accusations, and they become more and more implausible the more you look into it. It was also striking that when the judge gave his summation, he described the priest's sacristy as the place where Archbishop Pell would divest. when in fact that was never the case. It was always in the bishop's sacristy. So there's some fundamental logistical problems in the evidence that was tendered, and the findings really do have to be overturned on appeal. It's going to be very, very difficult to achieve that. The Victorian legal system isn't a case where the judge has the final say. It's the jury that has a final say. And finding 12 jurors tried and true in the state of Victoria is going to be a very, very difficult thing for any priest who's brought before a Victorian court, whether he's innocent or guilty.
So let me get this straight. We were basically talking about the story of one witness without corroboration. There was no other corroborating witness, no DNA, no other substantiating evidence in this case, but the word of this person who claims they were abused. Is that right?
No, there are in fact 20 Crown witnesses called by the prosecution who testified in court and were effective alibis. It would be normal that if a single alibi existed, that the police would not progress any charges, and it certainly wouldn't be brought to trial. In this instance, Archbishop Pell had 20 people who were able to say that what occurred is impossible. His master of ceremonies, other altar servers, other choristers. Normally you would drop a case if you had a single alibi. Archbishop Pell had 20 alibis, all of whom have been ignored by the jury, and the uncorroborated testimony of a single individual is the basis of a conviction. It's alarming. It's distressing for me, not so much as a Catholic. I expected this to happen, given that Archbishop Pell has been a lightning rod for 20 years. But as an Australian, it's very alarming in terms of what our legal system has thrown up, and we can only hope that Cardinal Pell will actually be able to succeed in an appeal to the Supreme Court.
John MacAulay, you just mentioned that as an Australian you're struck by this and that Pell was a lightning rod. For those watching in from around the world, why was he a lightning rod, and why do you believe he's been scapegoated through this conviction?
I became an observer not just through the course of the trial. I started observing Archbishop Pell when he became Archbishop of Melbourne in the late 1996. One of the first things that started happening at the cathedral when I was an altar server there was every Sunday at that 11 a.m. Mass, a group called the Rainbow Sash Protesters, members of the gay and lesbian lobby, would come for communion wearing a rainbow sash. And Archbishop Pell became a lightning rod because he couldn't give those people communion. And he was very gentle, and he explained to these people, it's not because you're gay or lesbian, it's because you're making a protest at a very sacred moment. That immediately hit the headlines, and from that moment, Archbishop Pell was seen to be an arch-conservative and an ogre in the press. So this is actually a decision 20 years in the making, and I don't think any Catholic should feign surprise in terms of the amount of hatred that is out there for Cardinal Pell. Where we should be shocked is with regards to the way in which the legal system in Victoria is now able to find anyone guilty based on an uncorroborated testimony of a single individual.
Yeah, well, in full disclosure, I've known Cardinal Pell a long time, have interviewed him several times. He was an outspoken advocate for the right to life. He also was a very public spokesman against climate change. He wrote copious articles about this. I know that also attracted a lot of attention to him. So he made a lot of enemies by defending the gospel and speaking out of his conscience on other matters. John, you were an observer during most of the mistrial and retrial of Cardinal Pell. What was your impression of how the case was handled, not only by the court, but by Pell's attorney?
Look, Pell, in Robert Richter QC, has one of the most impressive trial attorneys in the country. Robert Richter is the judge who never loses even the weakest case, and yet in this unique circumstance, when Pell had such a strong case, our best attorney has failed to mount an adequate defence. That in itself says so very much about how skewed the mind of the jury was in prejudice against the evidence that was put before them.
Do you believe he should have stood at his own trial? He's such a brilliant man. Why wouldn't he stand and take the stand?
Look, a man who ignores the advice of his lawyers is a fool. Robert Richter gave him formal legal instruction not to take the stand. That was entirely appropriate. Also, I know Archbishop Pell, he's a deep thinker. He's not as agile on his feet. The evidence he gave before the Royal Commission was proof of that. Often he found himself addressing a previous question rather than addressing the question that was put to him. So I think it was a prudent decision for him not to take the stand, but unfortunately it didn't wash with the jury, and at the end of a very long trial, the jury found him guilty on all charges, and the consequences of that are a 6-year prison term, and currently Cardinal Pell spending 23 hours a day in solitary confinement.
Unbelievable. During the sentencing, Chief Judge Kidd made a point to say that he had instructed the jury that Pell was not to be made a scapegoat for any failings or perceived failings of the Catholic Church. He then added this.
Over the last period, we have witnessed, outside of this court and within our community, examples of a witch hunt or lynch mob mentality in relation to you, Cardinal Pell. I utterly condemn such behaviour that has nothing to do with justice or a civilised society.
Do you think the jury ignored the judge's instruction regarding Pell as a scapegoat? And how much was this witch hunt mentality influencing the jury? Was the church on trial?
Very much, and unfortunately not just the hierarchy, but it's lay Catholics now who are feeling the brunt of this. The effects of the mass media and social media upon lay Catholics, who are now themselves to be scapegoated for the awful sins of a small number of Melbourne clergy. So from securing the scalp of Archbishop Pell through to lay people who as Catholics need to essentially batten down the hatches because we're all coming under attack. This is the equivalent of hitting up on and persecuting, for instance, a woman who's been subjected to domestic abuse. Lay Catholics are now the ones sporting the bruised eye, but should we be ashamed in public, or should we be able to hold our head high? It's an awful situation for lay Catholics, but Archbishop Pell is the man who is being scapegoated, but the effects of this will be intergenerational on lay Catholics throughout Australia.
Several times during the 70-minute sentencing, Chief Judge Peter Kidd characterized Cardinal Pell's behavior as brazen and called him extraordinarily arrogant. This is what he said at one point.
The brazenness of your conduct is indicative of your sense of authority and power in relation to the victims. You offended against 2 victims despite the fact that the door was unlocked and despite the risk that either victim could have run from the room or later complained. I think you did give thought or reflection to this offending, and the only reasonable inference from the brazen circumstances of your offending is that you had a degree of confidence that the victims would not complain, either immediately or by running out at some later stage.
How would he have any confidence that they would not run out with the door open after Mass? I found this oratory absolutely ridiculous, given what we've heard and the insubstantial witnesses and evidence presented in this trial.
Raymond, the system is such that it is the jury who decides what the facts are. If there was CCTV footage of that entire morning and the recessional of the choir boys that showed that this never happened, a jury still has the ability to decide another story. The judge is absolutely bound by his professional obligations to mount the sentence entirely based on whatever facts the jury decided applied. In this case, the judge has no choice but to work off the decision of the jury. It must be a very awful and difficult task for such an eminent jurist as Chief Judge Peter Kidd. His handling of the trial was of a very high standard. The reality is the jury decided to entirely ignore him, and even if CCTV footage was to come forward, it doesn't change the fact that there's a legal conviction, and the only way for the Cardinal to move forward from here on in is to attempt to appeal a jury's decision, which is unprecedented in Victoria.
Wow. There was a case of another archbishop earlier who was convicted. Now, in this case, it was of covering up crimes. He wasn't personally implicated, but he was convicted, and then it was overturned on appeal. And the reason it was overturned is because they said there was an inherent bias against the Catholic Church. Do you think that that might work in Pell's favor, or is our Australian society so scarred right now that they don't want to hear that, and that might hurt Pell's appeal?
The very fact that the publicity that was given to the case of Archbishop Philip Wilson in the Magistrates Court of Newcastle has been given no publicity with regards to his acquittal. I expect the same situation will occur here, where there's wall-to-wall coverage between now and the appeal hearing for Cardinal Pell in June. And as soon as that's overturned, God willing it is, then you'll get no further press. The mud will stick, and essentially they've secured the scalp of Australia's leading churchman, and history will be written not by the vanquished, but by the victors.
Wow. He was sentenced to 6 years. He could have gotten 50. Your thought on the sentencing that Judge Kidd handed down?
I sat through the court case. I have a very high regard for the handling of the case by Chief Judge Peter Kidd. It was sentencing has to be with appropriate and judged by other similar cases. So I don't think there was anything particularly remarkable. There's a non-parole period of 3 years and 8 months. It's still a very long time, and the reality is it's more likely that at any point in the coming months, Cardinal Pell could leave that prison in a pine casket. He's not in great health. He's an elderly man, and this could in fact be the end of him.
Wow. What do you think of the canonical trial, which at some point will begin in Rome? And they've said that there's no plans to begin anything immediately, but when do you think that might happen, and what do you think we're looking at there?
Look, obviously it's very important that the Church doesn't start a canonical trial until the appeal process is completed here. If the Cardinal is to be stripped from the clerical state, that would have to go through a process in the Vatican, but that's of very little concern to us. When you have a man spending time in prison, when you have a leading churchman in Australia in this situation, I think Australians are quite browned off, and they won't be paying great attention to what's going in the Vatican when we've got so much to worry about with regards to our own legal system here and the state of the Church in Australia.
Yeah, John MACAULAY, thank you so much for being here. I am frankly scandalized by not only the way that this case was handled, but the solitary confinement the Cardinal finds himself in now. I'm also told he cannot celebrate Mass, he cannot have access to wine, altar wine, so he's even deprived of exercising his ministry at all behind bars, which seems a double penalty here.
He doesn't even have access to his breviary, the psalm book that he's prayed for 55 years in clerical life. He has a copy of the Bible. He isn't able to mix with other people, and he can only receive one visitor a week. These are tough conditions. But he's been magnanimous throughout the trial. We'd chat with each other. He was in very good spirits. For him, this is par for the course. There's a reason why cardinals wear red, and it would just be an extraordinary outcome if, in the end, Cardinal Pell is seen more as a martyr. But I just don't want him to be leaving a prison cell in a pine coffin, and that's unfortunately, with his heart condition, how this could end.
John, thanks again for being here, and we will certainly continue to monitor this case. And thank you for being so articulate and for filling us in on this case. Really wonderful insights. Thank you.
Anytime, Raymond.